Comments?
I have a question and then I have a comment after that. My question is, you talk about the search process, but what do you do to encourage the leadership after the new chair has arrived? Because as you mentioned, Dr. Nora, when coming from a different state, there's a different culture at that institution, and that person needs to be integrated, especially if it's the lone female chair or the lone minority chair. It is a different environment, and one is not always aware of the biases among the other chairs and the hospital administrators, et cetera, that individual has to deal with. So what process do you have at your institutions to facilitate the success of the chair once he or she is there?
I'll be happy to start with that. I think that's a terrific question, and you go to a lot of effort to recruit somebody and then you don't help them to be successful. And so we've tried to back into this in two ways. One, once we've worked with a final candidate and the deal is kind of done, if you like, we then move into the transition process, and we tend to stay engaged and not have that simply be in the dean's office, so that we're still supporting and not passing off a new candidate to people that the person may not know well enough. And so we keep that continuity and work a transition process, and now we've begun to work that out as well with a more formal orientation process and then a mentoring process, so that we try to sequence the transition of the person from being the candidate to being the new chair. And really, you know, it takes about 3 years for somebody to settle into an institution. And so many of us forget the importance of orientation and also mentoring. And mentoring doesn't even have to be within the institution. It can also be with an outside institution, or involving in whatever specialty it is. Lots of specialty organizations have mentoring programs where you can be assigned a senior chair, and that happened for me. It was really helpful. So that's what we do.
AAMC offers some courses for chairs and associate deans that we have found helpful. We have tried to develop networks. But candidly, as I have reflected on my leadership, I think this, interestingly enough, is one of the things I have not done as well as I would have liked to. Something that the organization has done to support my successor coming into the president role is identify a transition team that Dr. Gershon will be able to use informally and formally to truly communicate with the community and the like. And as I have looked at that, I think that is, in my future, if I have the opportunity, those will be the sorts of things I will try and do a better job with.
And very briefly, a couple of books that we use are The First 90 Days and Right from the Start. We encourage mentoring and assign someone formally to do that, and encourage frequent interchange, weekly at least, in the first few months, and for each individual that's a little different. Longer term, we have annual, of course, performance appraisals. We use a book from the Lowinger Institute called FYI that lists the 67 core competencies of managers, leaders, and so forth. And I always choose for my direct reports 2 of those competencies. Those can be things like political savvy, learning on the fly, innovation, creativity, and so forth, 67 core competencies. And ask that they focus on those for the year. And then we have a dialogue about that, and there's references there that I encourage them to choose one and focus and concentrate on that one. And in our Institute for Physician Leadership, we assign formal mentors outside of their department to meet with them at least monthly.
Keith Joyner from the University of Arizona. One of the things that you haven't talked about is actually landing the individual that you've identified as your top candidate. And I think I'm reflecting on this quote at the top, there's no way to spend too much time on obtaining and developing the best people. There's a sort of a counter argument to that, and there's there's evidence in the organizational behavior literature that the longer the time you spend on a recruitment and the more candidates you have, the better candidate you're likely to land, but the more disappointed you're ultimately likely to be in that candidate, because you have this phenomenon of the winner's curse of the bidding keep going up to get your top candidate. And I'm just curious, what your experience is once you've identified who you want to recruit in terms of ultimately landing them, and if you think that takes too long, and you ultimately end up expending too much effort for the ultimate end result.
So great last question to wrap up this session, and so let me ask the panelists to comment if they wish, and then we'll draw this to a close.
I think the end stage of a search is extremely complicated. Everybody would like to have it over yesterday. It's very important to have a clear memorandum of understanding and have the details of the final agreement very explicit, so that the person feels comfortable and feels that they can return to that at some later stage. I think, like the other aspects of the search we've mentioned, there's a lot of variability across institutions and how that final closeout is done. I must say it's still an opportunity to learn about the person, and we walked out from a close to final arrangement because we just felt it wasn't going to work with a candidate that we interviewed several years ago. And so even as you're honing in on the final candidate, it's still an opportunity to understand, is that the right candidate or not? And because it's such an important threshold for the institution, it really is important. You mentioned it earlier, the importance of fit. It's really important to get that right from the end. So that makes it complicated and draws out the time process.
And I would reference Lois' personal experience with 3 calls that gets your attention, and I have a particular affection for a little drama and theater in bringing that to closure, because the more quickly you can do it, I think the better. And so I will have personally driven to adjacent states to say, I'm coming over, we'll have dinner. Calls in the evening to talk with the individual. Have encouraged some of my chairs to take flights to North Carolina to take someone out to dinner. It really makes a statement whenever it's very personal, and that you've gone out of your way to show your regard and attraction to that candidate.
I think the relationship is extremely important. And I don't know if I should say this on tape, but I will. I recognize that I was not my institution's first choice for my job, but I was sure their best choice. And well, I mean, and where it's been very helpful for me is whoever is our ultimate choice is our first choice in a search process. And someone very wisely once told me that the best candidate is the one with the right character, the right competency that you can afford, and who's available at the time that you need them. And I take that to heart.
Well, with that comment, we have come to the appointed hour where we have to bring this to close. I'd like to thank our 3 panelists for their wonderful ideas, and Lois, Ron, and Peter. Thank you to you for being here, and I'd like to thank my research colleague April Clarice and Stephen McKenzie, who's over here in the corner, who put a lot of the details of this together. Thank you all.